Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Janine Madan-Keller, a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Global Development and the Assistant Director of our Global Health Policy Program. We're really pleased to welcome you all to today's event. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, and they're all going to weigh in on the important issue of transparency in global COVID-19 vaccination efforts. This issue has rightly been top of mind. The communiqué from this past weekend's G7 summit highlighted the need for reliable, transparent, up-to-date, and clear information on procurement and delivery of COVID-19 vaccines and other tools. We've also seen the issue rise to the top of the agenda by institutions like the WHO and World Bank President David Malpass. But despite the rhetoric at the highest levels, calls have been largely unanswered by the global community. So today's discussion is going to build on a new report from Transparency International and colleagues at the University of Toronto. The report actually starts to put some numbers behind this issue, and it shows just how in the dark we are about information related to two key aspects of the global vaccine effort: COVID-19 clinical trials and contracts for COVID-19 vaccines. Consider this staggering finding from the report. Only 6% of about 180 contracts between developers and public buyers have been released in the public domain through formal channels. There's a need to push for transparency on several aspects of the COVID-19 response. But for today's event, we're going to zoom in specifically on the importance of greater transparency around COVID-19 contracts. One piece of the issue is what specific kinds of information we need and can be useful for driving decisions by different stakeholders. Another complementary side of this issue is around how we can get that information out in the public domain, how we can incentivize more systematic and routine sharing in the public domain, not just in the immediate context of the response, but also when the next crisis hits. So we're going to kick off today's event with a presentation from colleagues who worked on the report. They'll share key highlights and findings, and then we'll move into a panel discussion with a broader range of speakers. I'll also make sure we leave time for audience questions. You can all submit your questions through multiple ways during today's live event. You can submit them on CGD's YouTube feed. You can also send them to us via Twitter using the hashtag CGDTalks. And you can email them to us at events@cgdev.org. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan Cushing, who's the head of Global Health at Transparency International, to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. The last 18 months have seen unprecedented efforts put into the development, production, and distribution of a vaccine against COVID-19. Yet, as I'm sure many of you know, there's still a long way to go before everybody around the world is vaccinated against COVID-19. And with COVID having had such a huge impact on the world, it's vital that every effort is made to tackle it. There's been a lot of talk about transparency in the response to the pandemic, but we still need to be more specific about why transparency is important and where we need to see transparency in the response. Opacity in both the development and procurement of vaccines, as with other medical technologies, can slow down the rollout and uptake of vaccines, hindering the response. In addition, three distinct features of the development processes of COVID-19 vaccines make a clear case for transparency around vaccines. There have been large sums of public funding invested in the development of vaccines. Every country around the world has an urgent need to access vaccines, and there's an urgent need to enhance public confidence in vaccines to ensure greater uptake. Our recent report, launched last month, For Whose Benefit, analyzes the transparency of COVID vaccines delivery process in two key areas, in clinical trials and in the procurement of vaccines. And we make a series of recommendations as to what we believe needs to be done to get it right, both in the current pandemic response and also to ensure that globally we're better able to respond to future pandemics. I'd like to introduce my two colleagues, Natalie Rhodes and Tom Wright, who will now provide an overview of our work, first looking at clinical trials and then looking at procurement.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of, as John mentioned, transparency in COVID vaccine clinical trials. So transparency in clinical trials is a really important issue, as it's well recognised that clinical trials are vulnerable to manipulation in order to make a medical technology look more effective or look safer than it is in reality. This can be done through hiding of clinical trial data, fabrication of data, or manipulation of data. So this is a very well recognised risk, and there's some quite famous examples from the past, such as Tamiflu Vioxx, for example. And transparency is seen as a key tool in order to mitigate this data manipulation, in the form of all clinical trials should be registered on a publicly available platform. The protocols to be shared, the results, the data, all to be made publicly available, not only to deter fabrication or manipulation of data, but also to allow expert scrutiny of that data to highlight any red flags in the data, and also to increase confidence in that medical technology because it puts out a message that there's nothing to hide. So in this report, we looked at the 20 leading COVID vaccines. This is the 20 vaccines that were in phase 3 clinical trials as of January this year. And specifically, we analysed 86 trials that are registered with these 20 vaccines. So to start with, we looked at the policy landscape around clinical trial transparency in order to get a sense of what are the standards of transparency and data sharing we can expect. So we looked at 9 key jurisdictions, and these are the jurisdictions of which these developers are based, and also where 80% of all the clinical trials have at least one clinical trial located. The key finding from this was that there's a real lack of harmonisation in clinical trial transparency policies in these jurisdictions, so different transparency standards are required depending on the location. But in particular, and what is most relevant in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that there's no explicit guidance or policy on how data should be shared in the context of a public health emergency, in terms of what data needs to be made publicly available, in what format, on what platform, and in what timing. And it's this policy gap which leaves this sort of grey area, and where we rely on voluntary actions on developers to proactively act transparently or not, in the absence of explicit guidance. And that's what we saw in the context of the COVID pandemic, or we are seeing. So we looked at clinical trial protocols. So protocols give really crucial information on how a trial is to be ran, who is to be included, how will it be analysed, what are the endpoints in order to define how effective or safe a vaccine is. And we found that clinical trial protocols had only been shared for just 12 of the trials that we looked at. So we're missing a lot of important information. This removed the opportunity for scrutiny and potential critique and narrative around how the trials are being run. And these are also really important details that are very valuable when trying to interpret results. Then when we looked at results, we found that results had been announced for just 45% of those 86 trials that we analysed. And a very significant proportion of those didn't actually publish any data analysis, meaning that for that 41%, we only had the top level results, and this was announced through media tools such as press release, press conference, media report. You might have heard this sort of expression, science by press release, which has been used quite a lot in the context of the pandemic. So this means that we're only getting this top level picture, and we're not getting the crucial information that we need of how is this efficacy rate, or how is that safety rate actually come about? What does the data actually show us? Without knowing that, we don't actually know the full picture of those rates. So when you combine the fact that we don't really know how a lot of the trials have been run, and we don't know the full information and the full data, it creates some concerns and a lot of questions still outstanding. And we've seen the implications of this. So I'm going to just discuss just 2 examples. The first being the Sinovac biotech vaccine. So you might have seen in the news yourself, there was a real variance in the efficacy rates for this vaccine in the different clinical trial locations, ranging from around 50% to above 90% efficacy rate, which of course is a huge variance. But for all of these announcements were either made through a press release or a media report, or even a Twitter account of a health minister, with no actual data to go alongside it. So this meant just questions arised, confusion arised. Why are the rates so different? And we didn't know the answers to that because the protocol wasn't shared and the actual data wasn't shared. And just important as well to highlight is that then this vaccine has actually been administered to people without having, at least from the public perspective, knowing exactly how effective this vaccine is. Another example is the Sputnik vaccine. So comparatively, the Gamaleya Research Institute, who are developing the Sputnik vaccine, have acted in a very proactively transparent way, in the way that they've published data analysis in peer-reviewed articles in the Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. So they've gone a step further and actually published data analysis. And then what this has allowed, because it's allowed greater transparency and scrutiny of this data, a group of international scientists have identified certain points of concern, questions over the methodology, identified potential hallmarks of data manipulation in the clinical trial data. And they have requested Gamaleya to publish the raw data, as this is the only way to properly scrutinize the data to confirm or deny these concerns. So we know, is this data as good as it shows it to be? And this is an example. It shows the benefits of publishing data analysis. If this hadn't been published, we wouldn't have been able to have this important narrative. So it's not a case of just picking out holes and trying to undermine trust in vaccines. It's actually to increase confidence in vaccines, because that allows these conversations to happen, this scrutiny, and that can increase confidence and trust. So finally, what do we need to address these issues? In the immediate term, we need vaccines to fill this gap that I've highlighted previously, and we need them to be more proactively transparent through publication of protocols, sharing of the data, raw data, data analysis. And this needs to happen, unfortunately, in a minute, it will be voluntary actions in the absence of this policy guidance. And this needs to happen in short term to fill that gap. And then in the longer term, we need to bring about policy change. So specifically this guidance or lack of guidance of how data should be shared during a public health emergency, as we've seen a real mismatch because there's no harmonized guidance or no guidance. And then why do there needs to be harmonization of global policies of transparency to ensure that we have greater global standards of clinical trial transparency? Now I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to talk about our findings from looking at contracts. I think you're on mute, Tom.
Every time. Thank you, Natalie. Here we'll talk about procurement and contracting, and in this case, the supply of COVID-19 vaccines, covering publication rates, redactions, and pricing transparency. The public releasing of contracts has been shown to have many benefits, among them improved accountability and learning processes. These two benefits are critical in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic because governments are operating without the advantage of precedents, and therefore with a heightened risk that something may go wrong. Our analysis in For Whose Benefit found that only 6% of contracts were released by buyers. These came from only 5 entities: the UK, Brazil, the USA, the Dominican Republic, and the EU, with only the USA publishing all of its contracts and the rest publishing an average of 25%. At the point when the analysis was conducted, we could find no contracts from any other buyer, including COVAX, which is projected to buy billions of vaccines. Despite the benefits of transparency, despite it being common practice in many regions, and despite these are perhaps the most important set of procurement processes in our lifetime, it seems that contractual transparency has become a casualty in the race to secure vaccines. Yet the story doesn't end there. With the exception of the Dominican Republic's contract with Pfizer, every release contract is heavily redacted. It's hard to convey the extent of redactions with simple percentages, but they are striking. Often, entire clauses or pages, such as shown here, are redacted, meaning that potentially untested exceptional clauses go without public scrutiny. The volume of redactions only tells one side of the story. These redactions often cover data points of critical public interest. The table here gives a brief overview of what is present in a sample of contracts. I won't go into detail about each row, but outside of the USA, aspects such as prices and timetables for delivery are systematically redacted. The extent of redactions and lack of justification adds uncertainty in a time where confidence is key, a point compounded by the fact that both parties in negotiations may have incentives to keep things secret without normal or acceptable rationalizations. In an attempt to crystallize the public interest argument for transparency, the report goes into detail on two parts of a contract: indemnity clauses and pricing. Using the incomplete data sources available to the public, it attempts to tease out potentially concerning trends that may be applicable to the wider contractual environment. Here we'll be discussing the issue of pricing. The graph here shows prices paid by economies for one full course of a vaccine, ordered by GDP per capita. Whilst variances can be somewhat explained by the procuring of different vaccines, on average, high-income economies and lower middle-income economies paid similar amounts per contract, whilst upper middle-income economies paid the most of the three groups. Of course, even at not-for-profit pricing, prices can vary because of quantities ordered and delivery costs to different regions. However, for me at least, I question whether this can be described as an equitable pricing structure. Furthermore, significant anomalies exist, raising questions as to why countries such as Senegal and Ukraine procured the more expensive types of vaccines. Was it, for example, due to the lack of cheaper vaccines due to stockpiling, or something else we don't know of? Looking at vaccines developed by specific companies also showed high variances of prices paid. The AstraZeneca developed vaccine, for example, is the cheapest for high-income economies, drawing into question the veracity of their commitment to ensure broad and equitable access. Whether looking at the macro level or at specific vaccines, the resulting concerns and questions can in part be answered or confirmed by releasing contracts, adding credence to the case for transparency. So, what happens next? Release all COVID-19 vaccine contracts publicly, and if necessary, with minimal redactions that are clearly justified. This won't be an easy task and will require a lot of strategizing and effort from people around the globe, but I hope we can start to answer the question of how later in this webinar. The more long-term recommendation mainly refers to the need for robust guidance and regulation to ensure transparency in a pandemic situation. The potential international treaty on pandemics provides a good opportunity in this sense. But now I'll hand over to Dr. Gillian Kohler, who will conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for your comments. So I'm going to take it to more of the macro level and focus on transparency and accountability's importance in procurement. Let me start off by saying, in the best of times, procurement stands out as a government function that is at the highest risk of corruption. In the worst of times, during emergencies, we need to move fast, so corruption risks are amplified due to the need for speed and flexibility. And that is why transparent and accountable public emergency procurement processes are vital. Governments are responsible for ensuring that procurement is carried out efficiently and with due diligence to guarantee quality of public service delivery and protect the public interest. So they need to ensure there's also accountability here. And that's to ensure that relevant institutions answer to those who will be affected by decisions or actions taken by them. Accountability, as we know, can reduce the risk of corruption, abuses, assure compliance with standards and procedures, and improve performance in organizational learning. It also demands that institutions explain and justify their results to internal and external monitors or stakeholders, and impose sanctions when performance falls short or corruption is found. And clearly, greater transparency in the procurement process is needed because it allows for, as Tom pointed out, easy comparison of prices paid for products. This allows for more informed decisions and can over time lead to greater purchasing power for governments, which is critical, and other entities, so they can negotiate prices with suppliers fairly. Transparent pricing data can illuminate patterns and any outliers such as overpayments, even collusion or kickbacks that might be happening in the procurement process. Secrecy historically has been a common characteristic of the global pharmaceutical industry in order to protect its commercial interest. This, in my view, has never been acceptable. And as the saying goes, in times of crisis, there is opportunity. And the global pandemic is an opportunity to have governments and international organizations insist on transparency from the pharmaceutical industry, and in doing so, to heighten its accountability to the global public. Governments and other purchasers need to shine light on their contracts with suppliers, be forthcoming with what they're paying, what their negotiating looks like, and why, in order to boost public trust and confidence in our supply of COVID-19 vaccines. COVAX, as mentioned, is not releasing its contracts. It has been encouraged by a number of NGOs to make its contracts transparent. COVAX has responded by saying that their contracts contain commercially sensitive and proprietary information. This is not good enough. I would also say, speaking from Canada, that my own government has also answered a similar way to COVAX, protecting the interest of the private sector over and above the public interest. Transparency and accountability with it are non-negotiable. Without them, inequity abounds. At the 72nd World Health Assembly, which was in 2019, a resolution was passed on improving the transparency of markets for medicines, vaccines, and other health products. Our case for transparency is very much in line with global policy direction. I will close by saying it is essential to integrate transparency and accountability measures in procurement practices if we hope to ensure better access of the global population to life-saving and essential COVID-19 vaccines. Thank you for your consideration.
Excellent. Thank you everyone so much for helping to set the scene for the rest of our discussion. And thank you so much, Jillian, for highlighting that even in the best of times, there are lots of problems and inefficiencies that plague public procurement processes. Indeed, a couple of years ago, colleagues and I at the Center for Global Development have done some work on looking at global health procurement more broadly. So all of those points resonate very much. And as Tom pointed out, these issues are complex, and it's not necessarily going to be easy to move the agenda forward. So really hoping we can spend some time throughout today's conversation to unpack some of the key actions, incremental steps that we can push forward to help make progress on this front. So with that, let's move into hearing an initial round of reactions and thoughts from some of the other speakers we have on the line. So I'll invite them all to share very brief, let's say 2-minute reactions to the presentation and the report. And then I also have some specific questions that I'll follow up with. But let's turn to the speakers to share reactions, what you all see as the key challenges from the perspectives of the institutions that you all sit at. What do you see as some of the most important and compelling pieces of information and components of information that would be most important for different kinds of decision makers? Delivery schedules are extremely pertinent in the current context. Production capacity, prices, quantities. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. So maybe first I'll turn to my colleague, Dr. Javier Guzman. Javier has just joined CGD. He's the new director of our Global Health Policy Program and also Senior Policy Fellow here at the Center. And I should note that in a prior role, Javier served as the head of Colombia's National Regulatory Authority as well. So lots of important perspectives to bring to the table. So over to you, Javier, for brief reactions to the presentation and report.
Thank you, Janine. The first thing is, well, thank you very much to our colleagues from Transparency International and the University of Toronto. I just want to make a few points. The first one is, we know, this is a problem, and putting figures to it is very important. So the 6% number was striking to me. And I understand, the points about, it is problematic because One, the public deserves to know. Two, because the lack of transparency could lead to fraud, corruption, or could even undermine public trust. But I want to focus, the impact on the global response to COVID. I think this is a huge, I think the issue of a lifetime, because the lack of transparency clearly limits cooperation and increases, nationalism, and it doesn't allow policymakers at the global and national level to properly, respond in the best possible way. But the key question is, what do we do? We know the problem, and what do we do with that problem? First, I have to say, policymakers, governments have signed confidentiality agreements. So they are not able to disclose any information. And this is problematic. This will be a seller's market. And it is a big market. We're talking about, $54 billion this year. So what can we do to, make sure that we just change the rules of the game? We change the rules of engagement. And I think the moment is now. It's not too late to do it. And the big steps need to be taken by champions who have secured, the deal. So champions who already have the vaccines, and we're talking about the EU, the US, UK, Japan, Canada, Australia, they all have secured doses for more than double of their populations. But I think it's not just enough to say, okay, let's publish the contracts, because that is not, for anyone, for any policymaker, it's not easy to, extract the information, standardize the information, compare the information, and we need a host. It's not that we just publish and then the governments need to go and find all the different publications. So I think the big question on the how is, where do we host a platform like this? Who can maintain a platform like this? Who has the leverage to actually engage the right people to get a platform like this? And I'm not gonna be, very, out of reality here. We will not be able to get everything. So we do need to prioritize. And the key pieces of information, I guess, we need to get now are those that do have a negative impact on the global response. Janine alluded to them. We don't know about scheduling, about manufacturing capacity, about price. So I think we should have that discussion, what elements. And if we do need to do anonymized, so it's not about, the specific company, the specific country. It's about having the data in a single place for consumption. I'll stop there. Thank you, Janine. Over to you.
Thank you so much. All great points, and I'm hoping we can come back and unpack them all in the rest of the conversation. But let's turn now to Dr. Nikais Ndembi. If you're on the line, I know you might have been having some connectivity issues, but we'd love to hear from you next. Dr. Ndembi is the Senior Science Advisor at the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And we've all been reading so much about the efforts of the Africa CDC on this front. So would really love to hear your reflections and reactions to the presentation and your perspective on some of these real challenges we're confronting. So over to you if you're on the line and can hear us.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. My apologies again. My internet connectivity is a little bit, so we're going to be having elections here. So all those things are impacting our network and then connectivity as well. But I think this is a topical issue, very important topic. Threefold here. The first one is on clinical trial. I do agree on the transparency, but let's keep in mind that we're dealing with human subjects, and there's a guidance around that. And there are a couple of ethical issues in disclosing patient level data. So there's a restriction at which you can really share information in terms of clinical trials. We really have to bear that in our mind because that can be really, a limiting factor in engaging the community in some of these clinical trials. Because if patient level data are being released in the sense of transparency, and then they can be actually linked to individuals, and these can be damaging for clinical trials. I think that's just the caution on the clinical trials on at which level data can be shared. I do agree there should be a certain level of checks in terms of integrity. Yeah, I also strongly agree that a publication is not necessarily equivalent to integrity. So we agree. We've all seen what happened with the chloroquine, the pressure from the farmer to get some of this paper, the paper withdrawn from the Lancet. I've seen an example of the Sputnik published in the Lancet. Publishing a paper in the journal, and even a high impact factor journal, is not equal to integrity. I absolutely agree on that point. So, but there are some checks that we need to do. So in the clinical trials, obviously, if not limited to a specific country where there could be some political control of the research on the science, there's usually a data safety monitoring board. And the data safety monitoring board will cover a wide range of individuals with expertise that can actually review the data. So it's not a property of the principal investigator. And also the review of those papers that we all publish in the Lancet or Nature or whatever, they are individuals like you and me reviewing those papers. And it depends on also of their capacity to pick some of these faults or limitations in the paper. So I think that's the first stop on the clinical trials. There's a pros and cons here where we can actually release some of this information. So that's one. Then the second one is now on the, we talked about it on the pricing, the deals. So yes, that's equally important, but let's bear in our mind, we're dealing here with experimental vaccines. Those vaccines, this is COVID-19. But if you're looking at products that have been approved, if you're looking at probably HIV drugs, probably second-line drugs for HIV, there's no reason why we shouldn't disclose the protocol, why we shouldn't disclose all the costs and all those things. But for experimental vaccines, at some point, I'm in the middle. I ask myself, these guys are still working on the product. They haven't gotten a patent, right? Literally, we can say this is a product to go. We're an emergency, and they had emergency use listing. It's not a final product, it's an experimental. And this can be discontinued. We have seen that even. For clinical trials, almost at least 3, AstraZeneca, J&J, they've been paused for some safety concerns. Maybe we know that. So it means that how do you go in this situation, start pulling and pushing it at some extent to get this price? It doesn't, this product cannot probably at some point been approved finally for use. So that's just the caveat there. But I strongly agree that in the course of the pandemic, we should look at it as a humanitarian problem, not as a beneficial. I think benefit should be second, because we really want to look at that as a benefit, and then as a commodity, that's an essential commodity that could actually help break really the chain of transmission, if we're referring to vaccines and so on. So a civil society are very, that's why I like it. I like really their push. They are really instrumental in ensuring that some of these, the costs have been released. And from the African Union, Africa CDC perspective as well, we're looking at our vision is around transparency. Of course, then it means that we have to release the costs, but also looking at how this company are protecting also that balance. There's a trade-off here to get their patents and then get some of these things. So during the course, I'll probably shed more light on our deals on the 400 million doses with J&J. We've engaged with several other partners. We've engaged with several vaccine manufacturers before getting there. Over 50, we've gotten responses. We have not gotten, some have not disclosed. We had to sign NDAs. But this is very an interesting and exciting field that is good to share experience on. Thanks, and over to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much for those rich reflections, for highlighting, the different trade-offs that are important to keep in mind, and also this theme around sort of publication and putting information out there in the public domain is certainly important, but is a sort of first step. And there's a lot more to be done once that information is available to make it actually kind of useful and drive and impact decision-making in the real world. So thank you so much, and we'll come back to you for more thoughts. But let's move now to our colleague, David Wilson, who's the program director within the Health, Nutrition, and Population Global Practice at the World Bank, to hear some reactions from your perspective on these issues. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Janine, and thank you to Jonathan, to Natalie, to Tom, and to Gillian for a wonderful presentation. And I think you compressed so much on both the scientific and the procurement side into a short space of time. And my brief response would be to say that I think you've highlighted very well where we have a scientific uncertainty. I would also say that these are amongst the most scientifically scrutinized vaccines we've ever seen. And there are no other vaccines where the average person on the street can tell you not only what vaccine they got, but what its efficacy is. I always say to my work colleagues, I'll buy a cup of coffee for the first person roughly my age who can tell me the name of one of the two shingles vaccines or one of the 4 flu vaccines they got, let alone their efficacy. So I think scientifically you're right to highlight some of the gaps with, for example, Sputnik and Sinopharm Sinovac. I would say that in some respects too, there's a lot of scientific scrutiny, which is positive. But when I move to analysis of market-sensitive information, I think you've done a brilliant job of laying out the issues, and I don't think one can disagree with anything you've said. My reflection is to say that having interacted with nearly all of the manufacturers, I've never seen a situation where there's been a more extreme seller's market or where sellers have so much power. And the heads of pharma companies are fated by presidents, by prime ministers. They really have more power than any elected official in the world at the moment. And I don't think that transparency will change until the market equations change to more balanced equilibrium between buyers and sellers. And I think in the meantime, we can highlight good practice where we see it. I think J&J's won global price during the pandemic phase for a single dose vaccine has been admirable. I think AstraZeneca's transparency about prices and also their focus on technology transfer has been commendable. I don't think everybody has lived up to those levels. I do think that in addition to ambiguity about price, or uncertainty rather about price, people have highlighted delivery as an issue. I think companies are trying to get more specific about delivery, but their clauses give them a lot of latitude, as you know. And then finally, there have been different approaches by manufacturers to really important issues of liability indemnification. And we've seen companies like AstraZeneca move to resolve this quickly and be able to proceed in many markets. And it's been more difficult elsewhere. I will say with regard to the World Bank, and this is my last comment, we do require the publication of all contracts over a certain size, and that's basically all contracts, including pharma contracts. But I will also acknowledge they are heavily redacted for market-sensitive information, just as colleagues have pointed out. And the final point I'll close with is I think everybody is nervous about not fulfilling whatever the requirements of manufacturers are because they're so nervous about losing access to vaccines. I finished a call this morning with a South Asian nation, and they basically said, we don't want to do anything that would imperil our ability to get vaccines early, so we're going to agree with whatever we are asked to do and say, and we encounter this so often. So thanks again for a marvelous presentation and for the chance to comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Okay, we have one more speaker, so let's turn to Eduardo Bojerquez, who's the Executive Director of Transparencia Mexicana, to hear his reactions and thoughts, and then I'll open it up and turn back to some of the presenters as well to weigh in with their thoughts on these reactions. So over to you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Janine. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon in London. I'm going to refer to certain aspects of learning from the presentation of our colleagues in TI Health. First of all, this is going to be a recurrent issue in the future. Vaccines are here forever, so we need to start working on this policy and guidelines that our colleagues were mentioning for the near future. This is not the last time we're going to talk about vaccines. And there is a lot of similarities with treatments. We have to start considering treatments and not only vaccines as part of this demand for higher transparency. That will be one first point. Second one, we have been focusing a lot on disclosing contracts, which is very important. After the release of this document, my country, Mexico, disclosed 5 additional contracts to the global list, which is now an important number of contracts coming from different origins. But there is a lot of room for improving transparency in other aspects related to contracts like logistics, distribution, and other items that shouldn't be classified as in the way they are classified right now, we can certainly open a lot of information related with public expenditure, which is not the contract to the vaccine itself. And we haven't done that, and we haven't discussed that. Delivering vaccines is a system, is not only a document. So there are a lot of improvements in terms of databases that are connected to the distribution and application of the vaccines everywhere. And finally, I will say that there are a couple of bigger issues to attend. One, countries like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, we tend to see to the north or to the multilateral agencies in terms of inspiration for opening our own issues. And this is the first case ever where no one can take the lead in terms of transparency and accountability. We cannot look north. This is when you're reviewing the data from Tom and our Natalie and our colleagues, we cannot look to the north again. We cannot look to the multilateral agencies or partners. We cannot look to different mechanisms for like COVAX to find a bigger or wider transparency and accountability. And this is a problem. This is the first time ever where we don't have leaders in the world to follow, but basically we are in the same situation everywhere. And I think this is a very, very hard lesson to take, and but also an opportunity, because now every country or agency that makes a minor contribution to the international situation is gonna change the game for the next decades. And another important and final point, this is when we talk about infodemics and we talk about fake news, we normally have to acknowledge that governments and the states are the only capable agencies to give order to the discussion. And now governments, multilateral agencies, states are not reducing but contributing to the infodemic part, to the fake news, to the disinformation of the globe. And this is a major issue that should be addressed. Governments and states are the ones that, by disclosing information, provide order, sense to a chaotic discussion in social media or with fake news. And this is not the case anymore. So we need to address the other problem, which is infodemics and truth, and how governments and states are not playing anymore the role of organizing and reducing the distortion of fake news and disinformation around the issue. A couple of comments from Mexico and the region, and hopefully we can organize a simple but effective agenda, because this is the new trend, and this is going to be forever if we don't act in the short term. Thank you very much, Janine.
Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing those perspectives, especially as they relate to Mexico and other countries in the region. And agree entirely. I think this is, certainly a top of mind and really important issue for now, but it's not going anywhere. And we're going to have to take into account all these important lessons we're learning. So thanks for those reflections. Let me turn back to our colleague Jillian Kohler to come in and maybe sort of reflect on, feel free to pick up on different pieces that various colleagues shared, and I would love to hear your perspectives as well. So over to you, Jillian.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank all the panelists for their really rich reflections. I'd love to talk about all of them, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to hone in on one or 2 points. And I think, David, I'm going to turn to you. And I was really, what's the word, heartened, I guess, to hear your comments on your viewpoints. And I wholeheartedly agree. It is a seller's market. And I think this is something that we all need to address in terms of asymmetric power relations, which is happening between the suppliers and governments, as well as the international organizations. And I speak as someone who did spend an awful lot of time working actually in the international organizations, having pharmaceutical industry try and lobby and influence policy. So I think, again, what I was saying earlier, in crisis, there's opportunity. So right now, I think we need to change the game with the pharmaceutical industry. And yes, indeed, we are grateful for the advances in science, but they were publicly funded. This is a time to start demanding transparency. And I'm also going to make one more point, and I'll stop here because I know that we're limited. But I think this also speaks to the larger issue of intellectual property rights and how come the pharmaceutical industry is being protected right now when we have a global pandemic, and the need for manufacturing capabilities spread widely throughout the globe is so critically important. So I'll send it back to you, Janine, but just want to thank all the panelists again for some really thoughtful comments, and hope to take this further.
Great, thanks so much, Jillian. Okay, back and over to Jonathan to come in and weigh in on some of these comments as well. Oh, Jonathan, you're on mute, or I can't hear you.
Hi, sorry, thanks, Janine. Yeah, two reflections, I think, kind of around the procurement stage. One thing that we didn't have time to present was kind of what is kind of obscured in the contracts. And one of the things that we've seen is the kind of the indemnity clauses. We just don't know what's in there. As David says, we know it's a seller's market at the moment. And we heard rumors kind of unverified that kind of certain companies are going to put liens on embassies in Washington. At one point, I can't verify that. But to what extent, kind of what have countries given up? What are the long-term cost implications in this for countries? It's very difficult for countries to make the judgment call there with the paucity of information. But at the same time, they have to do the right thing and get their citizens vaccinated. I think the other question, when we talk about seller's market, I agree with you, it's seller's market. How did we get there? 18 months ago, the message was very, very clear. We're in this together. We need a global response to a global pandemic. There was a mechanism, or there were mechanisms, of which COVAX was one of them, that we were meant to buy vaccines in one single entity and distribute them on an equitable basis. That hasn't worked. Had that worked, we would have arguably not been in this position of it being such a seller's market. We'd have been in a much better place. And I think we really need to examine that looking forward. It's arguably too late now, but as we move forward, how do we ensure we don't get into the same position going forward where we are in the kind of a position dominated by the private sector who hold all the cards in a future pandemic? Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, let's turn now back to Tom to come in as well. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you. I'm also going to respond to something David said. In terms of the seller's market, I completely agree that we're losing transparency because of that. But I would say that it doesn't have to be like that, and that's why one of the report's recommendations is to improve governance structures so that transparency doesn't become a casualty in negotiations. That's a longer term recommendation, and it can't happen instantly, but I think it's important to note.
Great, thanks so much for that. Okay, let's segue into picking up on Jillian's point about, in crisis, there's opportunity. I'd love to turn back to some of our speakers to unpack a little bit more and get in the weeds on what we think needs to be done. How can we address these challenges? They're big and complex, no doubt, but would love to hear from you all about what we can do in the near term. What specific kind of even incremental steps can we think about to help advance the agenda? So maybe I'll turn back to Dr. Ndembi, if you're still on the line. Would love to hear from you specifically on, the role you see regional entities such as the Africa CDC in working alongside governments to improve transparency, improve sharing of different kinds of data going forward. And are there specific lessons that you all have learned during the current context that we can think about informing approaches going forward, just like Eduardo was reflecting a little bit earlier on. So if you're still on the line, back over to you for some thoughts on those questions.
Thanks so much, Janine. Thanks so much. I think, as I've said, this is really an important topic for us on the continent. So let's put it in the context now. In the context of COVID-19, as we speak, we just have a fill and finish really capacity on the continent. So the entire chain value, we've identified about 10, they do actually manufacture, but only one can actually produce vaccines, even bought by the COVAX, by Gavi, by Gavi. So it means you have something here. We import 99% of the vaccines, regardless if it's COVID-19 vaccines or childhood immunization vaccines, and we only produce 1%. So there's something wrong here. It means that he who pays the piper dictates the tunes. In the negotiation, we are not coming in strongly here because we have to accept. So, I mean, you come in a situation where you have no alternative than say yes. And you've been asked to sign an NDAs to get access to COVID-19 vaccines to immunize your population, at least 60% to reach herd immunity. And you don't sign the NDA, you don't have the deal done. What do? Do you stop it? In the public health situation, you go it and just sign it and get the vaccine to your own people. But what we're saying, in the long run, when we revert this situation, in fact, that's what we're working on currently, to be able to produce in the next 10, 20 years, about 60% of those vaccines on the continent. Then at that particular juncture, we should be able to say, yes, if you don't get it, we're not signing these NDAs or we're making it publicly because we have at least a backup plan to be able to produce our own vaccines and then have that done. I think it's quite important that we put that in the context. Let's say the US or Europe, with that position, they have manufacturing plan all across the globe, they can definitely do that, but we don't have that luxury. We don't have that power in the discussion. And that's where we're projecting ourselves to say, this is gonna come. And then we've learned our lessons during this pandemic, and we're gonna turn that, probably shift it a little bit around and be in the power to be able to discuss some of these deals in a very strong way. As I've said, we've approached all the vaccine manufacturers, all those issues raised here, we discussed. And that you can see South Africa, for example, is pushing. They have a very strong civil society, and they're making sure that these deals should be made public. And if made public, if not actually following the process, it can be linked to some litigation issues. I think those are the first steps that we really want to see. You enter the deal with a farmer, you have to have it revealed or disclose the content of that deal. So now the second point on the cost and now also the NDA and how do we approach that? We have approached vaccine manufacturers with platforms similar to AstraZeneca, because someone mentioned it, but you see the cost 10 times higher than the cost of what actually is being proposed, which is ridiculous. So I think what we're trying to do now to bypass that is to have a purchasing power. We don't have the manufacturing power, but we project ourselves to be able to have that. And we're working towards that. As you recall, we have a donation for the MasterCard Foundation of $1.5 billion with component on vaccine manufacturing. We're going to get there. But now to be able to circumvent and get through that, we're having now a pool procurement on the continent. So for the 55 member states, all our procurement for vaccines are within the same line. So we have that power to negotiate with the vendors and with the manufacturers. So we are looking at 800 million doses. This is a huge market, at least for manufacturers. When you come to us, we tell you that this is not acceptable and we need this price to be revised. And at least, if not, at least at the same price with the COVAX facility. And that's what we're looking at. So you've heard of the partnerships for the African vaccine manufacturing. That's one of the solutions to our problem. Low middle income countries, we have to move on and then try to be actually independent and also build a resilient health system to be able to address that. I think I've answered your questions. I think those are the lessons learned. We have learned it from the commodities. When we had this outbreak in February on the continent, the 2 cases, at least from Egypt, we had no single test kit on the continent. We're only 2 labs out of 55 member states on the continent for a continent of 1.3 billion inhabitants. So we had to find a way to get these commodities in. I think all countries were actually focusing to address their own demand internally. I think these are the things that we have learned our own lessons. And then moving from there, at least we're trying to see that we implement a new public health order, we strengthen our workforce, we strengthen manufacturing capacity for diagnostic, therapeutics, and vaccines on the continent. We actually strengthen our networks, as well as strengthening our public health institute. Thanks, and over to you. Back to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much for those reflections and highlighting, some of the earlier points colleagues were making around the sort of different sides of the market. I think there has been a lot recently about the need to, think about the supply side, and particularly on the need to build regional hubs to produce and manufacture vaccines in the future. And certainly on the demand side, the role of purchasing power and and pooled procurement. These are all topics that colleagues and myself at CGD are thinking a lot about and writing a lot about. So I hope you'll all continue to engage with our work. But let's turn back to David. David, I'd love to bring you in here. You know, I know the World Bank and different arms of the bank are working together with several partners on a lot of these issues. So would love to hear a little bit more from you on what you think the World Bank and, you know, an institution like the World Bank's role really is. And I know there's, as I mentioned earlier, there really has been a lot of attention around this this point of greater transparency. So would love to hear what you think the World Bank can do, is doing, and can do in the future around sort of ensuring that there is greater transparency around vaccine supply agreements, particularly in the context of the loans and project agreements that the World Bank is finalizing within its recent $12 billion financing envelope. So over to you for some thoughts on those questions.
With pleasure, Janine. Let me begin by just adding to the previous comments on what we can do globally, then I'll talk about the World Bank's specific contribution. And I think on what we can do globally, I just want to highlight three things. The first of which is to say, at some point, probably in late 2022, early 2023, we will tip from a seller's market into a buyer's market, and the relationships will be much more balanced. So my point is, the sooner we can bring that tip forward, the more we can do it to accelerate production, the more even the relationships are going to be. So everything we do to accelerate production will contribute to greater transparency. The second point I want to make has been touched upon, and I think Ndembi made the point very nicely, but I also think on reflection, we've become very reliant on a handful of global production nodes, and that was extremely clear when COVAX based nearly all of their early production in Serum Institute, India, and India had a third wave and an embargo. So I very much echo the call for much more diversified and robust global production and the important role of the technology transfer that companies like AstraZeneca have engaged in to make that happen. And my third and more practical point is simply to say that I think the immediate thing we can do is to do everything possible to highlight good examples, and I've highlighted J&J and AstraZeneca, and to apply whatever pressure we can on companies who are not being as transparent, particularly using Jonathan's lever. They all received government funding, whether from the United States, the United Kingdom, or Germany, and that should give us some leverage. The difficulty, as colleagues have also said, is many of the governments who we would rely upon to exert pressure have themselves signed onerous non-disclosure agreements. But the more public pressure we can create, the better. On what the World Bank can do, I can touch on 5 quick points. And first, we have managed to persuade all our vaccine manufacturers to sign our anti-corruption guidelines, which includes access to an audit of all financial records. This wasn't easy, it took time, but we've achieved it. Second, we do require the publication of all contracts, including vaccine contracts. But as I've said, the overall amount is indicated, but information is often redacted. Third, I think that one of the greatest areas of uncertainty has concerned delivery dates, and we really worked hard through bank-facilitated procurement to get the greatest possible clarity about delivery dates. And I think we've seen examples in countries such as Lebanon, where we have managed to not only promote clarity, but ensure timeliest delivery. And fourthly, I would just say that in addition to vaccine procurement, which is really important, we're going to be spending an enormous amount on vaccine implementation. And we've done our best in our project documentation to be transparent about the estimated vaccine costs. And we've worked with WHO, UNICEF, and Gavi to undertake vaccine readiness assessments in over 100 countries. We've published these results, and we use detailed analyses of these readiness studies in our project documents, all of which are publicly available and easily searchable. And then the third point I wanted to touch on is we focused really intensively on vaccine prioritization to ensure that the most vulnerable, including healthcare workers and the elderly, are prioritized, and to try and avoid elite capture. And we've encouraged third-party monitoring of prioritization compliance by organizations such as the Red Cross. So let me pause there, but I think those are the ways in which the World Bank has been able to contribute so far. Thank you, and back to you, Janine.
Thanks so much, David, for coming in on both what we can think about sort of taking forward at the global level, but also some of those specific examples of what the World Bank is doing, and hope to see more, and we'll stay tuned. Let's turn back to Eduardo. Eduardo, maybe picking up on David's good point about drawing on promising examples. I was wondering if you could come in and share a little bit with us about your experiences of promoting accountability and transparency through different levers in the context in Mexico. Would love to hear if what promising examples and approaches you've seen, whether they relate to vaccines or other different products in the context of COVID-19. And what do you see as the role of civil society in helping to kind of pave the way forward on this agenda? Over to you.
Thank you, Janine. Very briefly, I think our common strategy for disclosing information has to put on one side contracts, which is a very sensitive issue, but the rest of the implementation system has also to be disclosed. Let me put you an example. Only 5 out of 19,000 contracts related to COVID have been disclosed in Mexico, which are for contracts, no? But we have 19,000 contracts which are associated to the whole management of the emergency and the sanitary crisis that could also be disclosed. So there is a lot of information that could be disclosed, which is not the contract itself. And I think we can work on that a little bit. Secondly, there is in the case of Mexico, we have been working together with the government to disclose the negotiations with pharmaceuticals, which is another important thing to keep in mind. So you may not have the public open version of the contract itself, but you can have access to the negotiation and how the Mexican government negotiate in which terms, and this is also crucial. And right now, some of the negotiations with the pharmaceutical companies have been disclosed in Mexico. So I think we're going to enter an analysis of how this happened and which are the conditions. Obviously, under the common understanding that this is a seller's market, and we understand that they were exercising a lot of pressure on governments, I mean the pharmaceuticals. Third, another important issue is the integrity of the companies that are pharmaceuticals. And we have discovered a huge difference in terms of the integrity policies of the pharmaceutical companies that are selling vaccines to Mexico and other countries. It is not the same to be Pfizer or AstraZeneca than CanSino or Sputnik in terms of the integrity policies of these companies. And that's an additional risk, Janine, that we should address. We need to secure that every single company selling to governments, and this is also related to David's point on the relationship with pharmaceuticals, have the same integrity standards, and they don't have them. There is a gap of 40% in terms of integrity standards from company to company in terms of vaccines. A final comment, civil society, Janine. Civil society started very early in March 2020, issuing alerts on procurement, on the way we were going to handle the crisis and the levels of transparency. But right now, I think we need to, again, start thinking in advance what is going on, what's going to happen in 2023, 2024, and the following years. And we need to start thinking about the new alerts. There are going to be new patterns, new problems associated with the distribution and implementation of vaccines, new transparency and accountability challenges. And I think we need to start thinking very rapidly for the next 10 years and not only for the current situation of these markets. The problem of pricing is gonna be a problem even if we move to a buyer's market. Disclosing the price is gonna be very complicated even if we change from a seller's to a buyer's market, and we're gonna face a lot of opacity also in the future. So we need to start thinking ahead and try to take advantage of our liberty and freedom, creativity to start thinking about the following problems and not only the current ones. Thank you, Janine.
Thank you so much for sharing those examples. And I should also say our colleague at CGD, Charles Kenny, has been writing and commenting for a long time on the issue of open contracting and transparency. I also know other entities and groups are also doing really excellent work in this space. Open Contracting Partnership, Open Budget Partnership, they're all working on these issues. Certainly more broadly than vaccines, certainly more broadly than even just medical products. So there's a sort of, collective effort there, which is great to see. I just wanted to make a plug to those of you watching and listening live. Please send us your questions. I'm going to turn back to our last speaker, and then we'll save time for audience questions. So you can send them in the YouTube feed, you can send them to us on Twitter, you can use the hashtag CGD Talks, or email events@cgdev.org. So just final plug for some questions. So picking back on Eduardo's point about thinking next, thinking forward, thinking about the next crisis, I'd love to bring Javier back into the conversation to talk a little bit more about that. And Javier, I would love to hear your reflections. You talked earlier a little bit about the idea of a specific platform where some of this information can be shared and analyzed and distilled. So I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit more. Could you share some thoughts with us on some potential incremental steps towards doing something like that, thoughts about existing platforms that can be built on and expanded, and what do you see as a role of different multilateral, regional and civil society actors in helping to kind of move this forward? So over to you to help round out the conversation.
Thanks, Janine. I think I have to say, yes, we need to think about the long term, but we should also think about the now. I don't think we should be, accepting the fact that we cannot do anything at the moment, and that we just need to wait until 2023 or 2022 when things change. I think this is a repeated game. I mean, yes, I understand at the beginning when the first contracts were signed, a lot of the high-income countries didn't actually were thinking about others but themselves when signing. But at this point in time, deals are being discussed. These deals are being, negotiated, and I think it is the right moment to use the different levers because this is a broader conversation. And I think few countries might actually lead a coalition of the willing to basically have that as a negotiation, as a point for the negotiation. So with the negotiation, it's not just about doses for my own country. Now we're talking about manufacturing capacity. We're talking about expanding manufacturing capacity, talking about IP, talking about what the long term is going to be. So this is an aspect that should be embedded within the negotiations. And I think because it's a repeated game, there is the possibility of changing the status quo. So that is the first point in terms of the how do we approach the issue now rather than in the long run. Now, in terms of your question about the platforms, I do think that publishing the contracts it's just the first step towards transparency. And if you go and talk to the country policymakers, those who are making the decisions, or those at the global level who are deciding on investing into manufacturing capacity, for instance, or into the schedules, that information needs to be done with few features. Well, of course, it has to be available, but it has to be standardized, it has to be timely, and it has to be understandable, it has to be comparable, it has to be relevant. That is why I do think that we need a clearinghouse, a platform, and that needs to be hosted within a honest broker, so someone who's trusted by the different parties. And a few ideas. I mean, you can expand on the existing UNICEF dashboard. I mean, they have done a great deal of work in terms of collecting the information from the press releases. I mean, you can basically expand on that repository, or you can look at the WHO market information for access to vaccines, which has been used and to some extent has been somehow successful. Of course, we can think about other trusted partners. I do think the World Bank is seen by many buyers and sellers as a trusted partner, and they do have a leverage. But I understand, it might not be easy to have this conversation at this point, but I do think that it could be a potential platform that could be used, not just for the now, but also looking forward. So having a mechanism to make sure that that information is published and available in the way I described. I mean, last but not least, I do think, just wanted to make the final point, I do think that the important point about changing the power balance and not operating as individual countries, not operating as individual buyers, is the only way to change this sellers market into something more of a balanced market. And I think there are many policy levers that the buyers can use and should use and should work together towards that aim. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Javier. Lots of food for thought there on different policy levers for certainly the current context and for the way forward as well. But let's focus for a second again on your points about the current context and what can be done now, even if it's not today or tomorrow. And I'd also love to bring Jillian back in to share any thoughts and reflections specifically on that. Javier shared some ideas, but would welcome others as well. And then if other colleagues have thoughts on, you've all touched on a little bit about some of the arguments that we've heard against this push for transparency, and it presently, but also in the past. And if others have thoughts on sort of why those arguments may not stand up to scrutiny right now, specifically in the current context, that I think could be helpful to get your thoughts on as well before we wrap up. But back to you, Jillian. Sure,
just briefly, just to emphasize Javier's point, I think we need to not just say, let's wait until things change and it's a buyer's market, it's what can we do right now? There has been a My Nations First approach, which has been problematic and has mitigated global cooperation in public health, which has been abundantly clear throughout this. So do agree that we need to have more countries working collectively. The issue is, what's the best international mechanism to coordinate that? Is it the WHO? Does the WHO have the credibility right now in order to do that? But again, so maybe we, as coming from different countries, need to be advocating for our governments to advocate to the WHO for more transparency in terms of the contracts, ensuring that we get more public information out there. Also, small steps in terms of the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, putting limits in terms of how they're lobbying, quite frankly, international organizations to get their policies and positions across. So operating from a position of transparency would allow for some of these very imbalanced power relations to be kind of more evened out. I'll send it back to you. Thanks, Janine. Thanks so much. Maybe I'll bring Jonathan back in if you want to weigh in on some of these recent or earlier comments from the conversation as well.
Thanks. Yeah, just to kind of pick up on the procurement and kind of what do we do next, I think there are a couple of points. One is that, as what Eduardo mentioned, we've seen kind of the civil society and the public pressure, and we as Transparency International and others have kind of been working both since the start of the pandemic, but prior to that as well, for the last 4 or 5 years in a lot of countries, to try and open up procurement in the health sector. And I think the recent events over the last 18 months have really kind of helped the public understand why transparency is really important. We've seen the PPE scandals, the kind of failures across the board. We've made that case as to why transparency is important. And I would encourage people, I think civil society needs to probably get together more, work more consistently on this, to keep pushing that, to keep pressuring governments at the national level, but also globally as well, to keep that pressure on to increase transparency. And on the publishing of contracts, I think agree with Javier's point that if we can get a central repository, that'd be really good. The issue is getting those contracts. How do we get those contracts? I mean, we host on our website the 12 or so contracts that we've got. Technically, it's not difficult to get hold of those, to publish them. It's getting hold of them that's the issue. And I know there are non-disclosure agreements, etc., in place. One of the recommendations that we suggested in the report was that some countries, those that have got secured high levels of vaccines, could potentially take the lead and actually go public with this and say, look, we're going to open up, here are our contracts. We think this is in the benefit of the world to see them, to see what's going on here. It would only take 1 or 2 countries to do that, to open the floodgates.
Great.
Hello, may I come in here, Janine?
Yes, of course. Over to you.
No, I think I just want to be sure I reemphasize it, because we might be speaking from different lens here and projections. I'm speaking from the low middle income country with complete imbalance in the power. So it's very important. It's either you disclose and you don't have any deal signed, and then your 1.3 billion people will suffer from that decision, or it's either now you find the best way to do that. I think there are some basic things that we all do. I think I just put it in the daily life. I'm with the view that, yes, there should be transparency. But I'm also in the view that without any balance in the power, the decision, it's quite difficult to do that. So let's put it just a very simple way. Those who are saying, let's get it out, transparency, would you publish your staff contract online? We can do that. If you can tell us that your company, all your staff contract and their salaries can be put online, I would say that that's good. That's the greatest transparency we can ever have in the world. It's very important. So, but the point I'm trying to make here, let's go for transparency. But transparency when we have balanced actually that power. That imbalance is not in favor to low middle income countries. Let's just be sure we bring that very clear in the discussion. The UK can stop this kind of deals and say, well, we're publishing all this, nothing will happen. They can do that, they can produce vaccines, they can do everything. But Africa, where do we go if we do that? You're not going to be trusted. I can give you a simple example. We criticize openly what 2 or 3 French journalists, you can do that, it's online everywhere, for their condescending comments and all that. But it was difficult for us to engage manufacturers for clinical trials because they felt that's probably, we went too much far, but it was true. We were telling them the reality. But the point is that the more you get too open, the more you get these people out, because they all speak is a network, and you don't get the vaccines. And then you're going to explain to your population why you're not getting the vaccines. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make, and then trying to just be sure that we have a kind of trade-off in between there. And then the last on that is probably, how do we value? I agree with the comment from one of the speakers around the vaccines being a public good. I entirely agree. Again, also, they will be heavily funded by government to get this out. So we're expected that there shouldn't be any secrecy there. That's obvious, because we know what it takes for researchers to put in all the investment from animal proof of concept, human proof of concept, clinical trials 3, phase 3 to get where they are. But this time around, they were heavily funded. So we don't understand why those details shouldn't be made public. So, but that's the question that we need to find out. Maybe a survey. We're not just pushing. Let's get the survey. I ask them why. Maybe they may answer, maybe they may not. So we get the feeler of what is happening. But my impression is that we really want to be sure that we have that balance. So one issue, just to close also, the TRIPS waiver, for example, as an example, very clear. It's not even around the costs. It's not around some of these, but we're not meeting the agreement. You see government, how they split it around that. But that shows you how the lobbying of pharma is really around and then moving pieces around. I think it's just something to look at and watch and see how we can come with clear next steps. Thanks. Back to you, Jen.
Thank you so much for those very important points and for highlighting some of the very important considerations that we need to keep in mind and underpin these conversations. And maybe just, I'm mindful of time and we need to wrap up, but I know Tom wanted to come in and share some of his thoughts. So over to you, Tom, and then we'll start to close out.
I just want to come in quickly on the initial part of what you just said, which is the negotiation imbalances, especially the difference between high income and lower income countries. But I just want to point out that transparency and the generation of a global evidence base can help to rectify those imbalances somewhat. I just wanted to make that point because I think it's important. That's all I wanted to say. So.
Thank you so much, Tom. We're unfortunately out of time. I know this is a, we skimmed the surface of a very, very important topic. There's a lot more to talk about, even when we just focus on the current context, that in and of itself is rapidly evolving with the emergence of variants, with the sort of talk of different need for different potentially boosters. So there's really a lot to unpack here, but I just wanted to thank all our speakers, presenters. Thank you so much for joining us here today and sharing your valuable perspectives. And thank you to our audience for joining us as well. Stay tuned. As I said, there's a lot more to unpack and hope we can continue these important conversations. Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.